On most days, we go in depth on a single story, but every so often we'd like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us here in Washington is China Daily's Washington correspondent and the deputy editor of China Daily USA, Chen Weihua. Simon Marks is the President and Chief Correspondent for Feature Story News. With us from Moscow is correspondent Lorna Shaddick. And also joining us here in Washington is Afshin Molavi. He's worked for Reuters, The Washington Post, and the Arab News, and is currently the editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Afshin, let's start with the war against Islamic State. The United States will be sending more troops to Syria. These are not combat forces, we are told. They're just advisors. UN-sponsored talks have been taking place in Vienna. Iran is now at the table. Where's all this going?
Well, Anand, we have the mahogany tables of Vienna versus the killing fields of Syria and Iraq. And I'm not optimistic that the mahogany tables of Vienna are going to win out here. ISIS is like a parasite that feeds off of deadly bacteria. And in this case, the deadly bacteria that they're feeding off of is this state failure in Syria in particular, but also in Iraq. They're also feeding off of this sense of Sunni siege in communities in Syria and Iraq. And the third bacteria that they're feeding off is the inability of the international community to deliver a decisive blow to ISIS, which allows them to seem triumphant to people around the world who flock to them. And there is a real danger, particularly as we see a rising tide of Europeans and Americans flocking to ISIS, joining the fight in Syria and Iraq, then coming back to Western capitals for terror attacks. So this is still a very dangerous moment.
Right, and the response is showing a great deal of disarray. Lorna, the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad has been holding talks with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Russian military, of course, involved in Syria. What is the Russian game plan here?
Well, it's interesting, you were just talking about that inability to deliver a decisive blow. And I think certainly Russia wants to position itself, at least here domestically, as the country that can deliver that decisive blow, both militarily in terms of its airstrikes in Syria, but also diplomatically. We've really seen it stepping up its diplomatic efforts over the last few weeks and months. It really did take the lead in those international talks in Vienna. But we've also had the UN Syria envoy right here in Moscow just in the last week or so. And Russia really wants to position itself as the country that can bring an end to this conflict in some way. Meanwhile, as the Americans, as far as President Putin wants to present it, are dithering around the edges and not managing to succeed. So I think Russia's game plan certainly is to continue those airstrikes going forward in Syria, but also to step up its diplomatic efforts. We've also heard from Moscow in the last week or so that it plans potentially to try and bring members of the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government here to Moscow in the next week or so for more talks. It really wants to position itself as a leader on this issue.
So Russia making the point that it has a role to play, it wants to be countered. Weihua, China is part of that multinational effort to find a solution to this. At the conference in Vienna, the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Li Baodong said there must be a political process, and China is calling for elections to resolve this. What would China like to see happen, and is that practical, elections in Syria?
Well, I think the political settlement is the solution, because if you look at the reality, you have the United States fighting ISIS, but also want to get rid of Assad. You have Russians who supported Assad and fighting ISIS. Obviously, the two big players are not really cooperating well and not making this fight against ISIS very effective. I mean, more inclusive sort of a cooperation could be more effective, and China has a stake. I mean, the ISIS has been spreading to a country like Afghanistan, which is in China's border area. So it's a threat to China. So China has a stake. But I think whether Assad must go, as President Obama declared, is up to the Syrian people, not U.S. leader or American. So this is, I think, what Chinese means. Should have election, should let the Syrian people to decide the outcome.
Simon, Islamic State, the threat that it poses goes well beyond Syria, but do you think there is a political solution to this, or is it just a military solution, or perhaps a combination of the both?
I think mostly a combination. But if you're going to get to that political point where you can sit down and negotiate this out and figure out the future, there has to be reality to the discussion that's taking place. And what's happening in so many different places now is a conversation that is not realistic. The White House spokesman here has spent the past 2 weeks clinging to this notion that American forces in Iraq and Syria are not combat boots on the ground. They're not engaged in combat. It's train, advise, and assist. No one in Washington believes that anymore. It's not a credible position to continue adopting. The Russian President Vladimir Putin thinks, as Lorna was saying, that he can ride in and solve all of this at a time when the Russian relationship bilaterally with the United States hasn't been worse since the end of the Cold War. That's not a realistic position on which you can build any sort of political conversation. So if people are willing to embrace candor and speak truth to one another, then perhaps you can get somewhere. But for as long as you're stuck in this almost surreal position where people are just not confronting the reality on the ground, it's hard to see how you get there.
Lorna, the threat from Islamic State could have taken an ominous turn this week. A Russian airliner crashed in the Sinai Desert after taking off from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. There is widespread speculation, and we have to say that some of the speculation comes from statements made by the British Prime Minister David Cameron, another statement made by President Obama, and a lot of speculation in the US cable news world that this could have been caused by a bomb. Now, Russia has said that it is suspending flights to Sharm el-Sheikh, which perhaps gives the most credibility to the theory that a bomb could have caused this. What is the Russian position on this? How is it responding to this?
Well, it's interesting that the Russian position has slightly evolved just over the last few days. For most of this week, it has been wait and see. That has been the message from the Kremlin. We're going to wait and see what this investigation on the ground involving 5 different countries, including the Russians and the Egyptians, as well as the French, the Germans and the Irish, comes up with as its conclusion. So every time any conjecture has been put forward about what might have caused the crash, they have just said, let's wait and see. And indeed, we saw some quite strong rhetoric from the Kremlin only on Thursday when the British made that decision to suspend their flights, saying, well, that's their sovereign decision, but we're going to allow our flights to continue. We're going to wait and see for that investigation to conclude, and we're not ruling out any theory right now. So just on Friday, we've seen quite an about face from the Kremlin, based, they say, on information, but they're not really, it does seem like something of a climb down for them. We don't know exactly why, but they have said it's not necessarily because the bomb was a terror attack. They say that they want to improve security at Sharm el-Sheikh as well in the meantime. But it does leave 45,000 or so Russian tourists stranded in Sharm el-Sheikh. And some have wondered what it might mean for President Putin here domestically as well, if it means that his policy in Syria put Russian holidaymakers in harm's way. But in fact, lots of the Muscovites I've been speaking to over the last couple of days or so seem to really have the opposite reaction to what you might expect. Instead of being angry at President Putin for putting their compatriots in danger, they're actually saying good on him for going after ISIS, and indeed he should step up his campaign and get rid of them once and for all.
Weihua, of course, China deeply concerned about international terrorism. How is this disaster being viewed in China? How is it being reported?
Of course, I mean, it's not sure whether it's explosive devices,
right.
But I think, you know, China, after suffering this earlier this year of the down of the Malaysia airline, most people, I mean, would be traumatized to see another, you know, passenger plane and killing so many people. I mean, the question is, what about the safety and the security of airliner and, you know, the airport? You know, how I think the international community, I mean, especially the developed country, could share this technology, know-how, expertise, you know, with others to ensure the security of our, you know, flights. And I think that's the concern, because people are traveling more. The Chinese tourists are going all over the world. So this is kind of a scary thing, people.
Afshin, there was an interesting comment I heard from a former FBI agent here in the United States talking on one of the US cable channels, and he said, no matter what caused this crash, whether it went down because there was something wrong with the plane or whether a bomb brought it down, this still constitutes now, with all this speculation, a propaganda victory for Islamic State.
No, I think that's right. I think Islamic State, thrives on these kind of, big, terrorist attacks, and partly because they want to continue to recruit from around the world. And as we talked about earlier, the inability to deliver this decisive blow, this is yet another example of their ability to project influence. Peter Bergen, who's the terrorism analyst, he once described Al-Qaeda as the Harvard of terrorist groups because they would only allow in an elite number of people. ISIS has a much more broad recruitment campaign, and they want to bring in people from around the world, and they're not exclusive at all. And this kind of thing does present a victory for ISIS, and particularly in their recruitment campaign.
All right, Simon, you know that expression, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And if we look at the enormous speculation that's been generated by US cable networks, I mean, it started well before there was even these statements from David Cameron or from Russia suspending flights, that Obama had brought this down. They were speculating 24 hours on this. What do you make of the coverage?
Look, I think it's inevitably a dramatic story when something like this takes place, and it's absolutely inevitable that it's going to lead to considerable amounts of speculation and disquiet among members of the traveling public. I mean, particularly for those people stranded in Egypt with no way of getting home. We've seen in the last couple of days the British ambassador being besieged at the airport in Sharm el-Sheikh by furious tourists who want to know how the British government is planning to get these people home. Now Russia cutting flights to Egypt. 45,000 people stranded there from Russia. This is the largest tourism market for the Egyptians now, coming from Russia. So this is going to be an issue, whatever the cause of this crash. This is going to be an issue that does lasting damage to the Egyptian economy.